The Mississippi Delta stretched endless and suffocating under the August heat of 1856, its cotton fields white and choking beneath a merciless sun that seemed designed specifically to punish those who labored beneath it. Magnolia Grove Plantation rose from this landscape like a monument to human suffering, its white columns gleaming with a brightness that mocked the profound darkness contained within its walls. The plantation house stood on a gentle rise overlooking 500 acres of cotton fields, its Greek Revival architecture designed to impress visitors with the wealth and power of the Pemberton family, who had ruled this land and its people for 3 generations. The house itself was a masterpiece of antebellum design, wide verandas wrapped around both floors, tall windows allowed cross breezes in the summer heat, and imported furniture-filled rooms where the family entertained neighboring plantation owners with elaborate dinner parties and balls. But beneath this veneer of civilization and culture, within the private chambers where no guests ever ventured, horrors unfolded daily that would have shocked even the most hardened supporters of the peculiar institution. If this story moves you, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more untold stories of resistance and survival to light. Among the 100 enslaved souls who toiled on Magnolia Grove from dawn until long after dark, Adira stood apart, not for any physical distinction that would mark her as different from the others, but for the quiet fury that burned behind her dark eyes, a carefully banked rage that she had spent 26 years learning to conceal beneath a mask of perfect obedience. She had learned early and painfully that survival in bondage required the ability to hide one's true thoughts and feelings, to present to white masters and mistresses exactly what they expected to see while keeping one's authentic self locked away in a place so deep that no amount of torture could reach it. This internal fortress had kept her sane through years of abuse that would have broken many others, and it would ultimately provide the foundation for an act of resistance that no one could have predicted. Adira had been born on Magnolia Grove to a mother whose name she barely remembered, and a father whose identity was never acknowledged, but widely understood among the enslaved community. Her mother had been a field hand named Sarah, a woman of remarkable strength and quiet dignity who had somehow maintained her humanity despite circumstances designed to strip it away. Adira's earliest memories were fragments of warmth and safety that seemed to belong to someone else's life entirely. Her mother's scarred and calloused hands braiding her hair in the dim light before dawn, carefully working her fingers through the tight coils while humming old spirituals that had been passed down through generations. She remembered the sound of her mother's voice, low and melodic, telling stories about a homeland across the ocean that neither of them would ever see. She remembered feeling protected and loved, feelings that would become increasingly foreign as the years passed and harsh realities replaced childhood innocence. Those protective hands disappeared when Adira was only 5 years old, sold away to a trader heading west to settle one of Master Pemberton's substantial gambling debts. The separation was sudden and brutal, as such separations always were. Adira remembered being held back by other enslaved women while her mother was loaded onto a wagon, remembered her mother's anguished cries and her own screaming, remembered the moment when the wagon disappeared around a bend in the road, and she understood with the terrible clarity that sometimes comes to children that she would never see her mother again. The girl who remained after that day was fundamentally changed. She learned quickly that love was a luxury that enslaved people could not afford, that emotional attachment was simply another weapon that could be used against you, that survival meant building walls around your heart and swallowing your grief along with your rage. She learned to wear submission like protective armor against a hostile world that viewed her not as a human being with thoughts and feelings and rights, but as property to be used and discarded according to the whims of those who claimed ownership over her very existence. The mistress of Magnolia Grove was Helena Pemberton, a woman whose physical beauty was legendary throughout 3 counties and whose cruelty was whispered about in equally awed tones among those unfortunate enough to suffer under her rule. With hair the color of honey catching late afternoon sunlight and eyes like chips of winter ice that seemed to look through people rather than at them, she moved through the plantation house with the unconscious grace of someone who had never questioned her right to own other human beings, to control every aspect of their lives absolutely, to inflict pain without facing any consequence or accountability whatsoever. Her beauty was the kind that painters tried to capture on canvas, and poets attempted to describe in verse classical features with high cheekbones, a delicate nose, full lips that could smile charmingly at dinner parties while issuing cruel commands in private. She dressed in the height of fashion, her gowns imported from Paris and New York, her jewelry expensive and tasteful, her appearance always impeccable. To outsiders, to the neighboring plantation families who visited for social occasions, Helena Pemberton appeared to be the perfect embodiment of Southern womanhood, gracious, cultured, pious, and refined. But the enslaved people who served in her household knew a very different Helena, one whose cruelty was made even more terrifying by how methodically and deliberately it was administered. She had married Augustus Pemberton when she was 23 years old, becoming wife to a plantation owner twice her age who had selected her primarily as an ornament to display at social functions and a manager of his increasingly complex household affairs. Augustus had needed a wife who could oversee the domestic slaves, entertain important guests, and produce heirs to carry on the Pemberton name and fortune. Helena had needed the financial security and social status that came with marrying into one of the wealthiest planting families in Mississippi. It was a practical arrangement that suited both parties, one entered into with clear eyes and realistic expectations rather than romantic illusions. By age 24, Helena had discovered that her husband's attention and carnal desires wandered frequently to the younger enslaved women who lived in the quarters, women who had absolutely no power to refuse his advances and no recourse whatsoever against his violations of their bodies and dignity. She would see him returning from the quarters late at night, would notice him watching certain women with predatory interest, would hear the whispered rumors that spread through any plantation when a master exercised what he considered his divine and legal right over enslaved women. What might have broken other women or driven them to confront their unfaithful husbands instead hardened Helena into something cruel and calculating. She seemed to make a deliberate decision that if she could not control her husband's behavior or punish him for his betrayals, she would instead channel all of her rage and humiliation toward the powerless women she blamed for attracting his attention. It was a perverse logic born of a system that gave white women very limited power over white men, but nearly unlimited power over enslaved people. And Helena wielded that power with devastating effectiveness. Adira entered the main house at 14 years old, chosen by Helena personally from among the field workers during one of the mistress's periodic inspections of the plantation's human property. The selection process was deliberate and cold, conducted with the same meticulous care that one might use when purchasing a horse or selecting fabric for an expensive new dress. Helena had walked slowly through the quarters on a humid September morning, examining the teenage girls with an assessing gaze that evaluated physical attributes, signs of intelligence or spirit, and potential usefulness for household service. She commented on features and skin tone with the casual cruelty of someone evaluating livestock rather than human beings, making observations about who was too dark, too light, too pretty, too plain, too smart-looking, too dull. When her ice-blue eyes finally landed on Adira, something had flickered in their frozen depths, not warmth or kindness, but a kind of predatory recognition that the girl was too young to fully understand, but old enough to fear instinctively. Perhaps Helena saw the girl's striking features, the high cheekbones and deep-set eyes that suggested a beauty that would only intensify with age and maturity. Perhaps she saw intelligence in Adira's careful expression, a quality that could prove useful in a house servant who needed to anticipate needs and follow complex instructions. Or perhaps, and this was what Adira came to believe over the following 12 years, Helena saw potential not for exceptional service, but for exceptional suffering. Perhaps the mistress had developed an instinct for identifying those who would feel pain most acutely, who would provide the most satisfying reactions to her various torments, who possessed enough spirit to make breaking them feel like a genuine accomplishment rather than the destruction of someone already broken. "This one," Helena had said, her voice carrying that syrupy sweetness that Adira would come to recognize as a warning sign of impending cruelty. "Clean her up properly and bring her to the main house tomorrow morning. I think she has potential to serve me personally." The first year serving in Helena's private chambers taught Adira lessons that no human being should ever have to learn. Lessons about the depths of cruelty that could hide behind a beautiful face and refined manners. Lessons about how power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The mistress had refined torture into a sophisticated art form, developing methods of inflicting pain that left minimal visible marks but caused maximum psychological damage. ensuring that her victims carried their scars internally where they could never truly heal. She seemed to have studied the most effective ways to break another person's spirit, to reduce them to a state of constant fear and anticipation of pain that was sometimes worse than the pain itself. Helena would have Adira stand perfectly still for hours at a time, holding heavy leather-bound books at arm's length, the girl's muscles screaming in agony until they trembled uncontrollably and eventually failed completely. When Adira's arms finally gave out and she dropped the books, Helena would express theatrical disappointment and assign even longer periods of standing the following day, creating an impossible situation where success was unattainable and failure was guaranteed. She would order elaborate hairstyles that took hours of painstaking work to complete, requiring Adira to stand behind her at the vanity mirror, manipulating pins and combs and ribbons with aching fingers, only to declare the final result somehow unacceptable and demand that everything be taken down and redone from the beginning. This could go on for an entire evening, the process repeated 5 or 6 or 7 times, until Adira's arms felt like they would fall off and her fingers bled from the sharp pins and metal combs. And still, Helena would find something to criticize. She would assign tasks with deliberately vague instructions, then punish Adira for not reading her mind and intuiting exactly what she wanted. She would criticize every aspect of Adira's appearance and service, with cutting words designed to wound the spirit rather than the body, calling her stupid, clumsy, ugly, worthless, ungrateful, a steady stream of verbal abuse that accompanied every waking hour of service. She would compare Adira unfavorably to previous servants, to other enslaved people on the plantation, even to Helena herself, making it clear that nothing Adira did would ever be good enough, that she existed only to serve and suffer, and that even her suffering would never fully satisfy her mistress's appetite for inflicting pain. But Helena's true specialty, the method of torture that she seemed to take the most profound and disturbing satisfaction in administering, involved fire. She kept an iron poker perpetually heating in the fireplace of her private sitting room, ostensibly for the practical purpose of tending the fire, but actually serving a much darker function that everyone in the house understood, but no one dared speak about openly. The poker was always there, always glowing, always waiting, a constant reminder of what disobedience or failure might bring. The first time Adira failed to meet one of Helena's impossible standards, arranging a tea service with cups positioned at angles that were apparently incorrect, though the girl could never determine what the proper arrangement should have been, the mistress had grabbed her wrist with surprising strength and held it close to the glowing poker, not quite touching the metal but close enough for the radiating heat to become unbearable, close enough for the threat to be absolutely and terrifyingly clear. "Do you feel that, girl?" Helena's voice had been almost gentle in that moment, carrying a sickening sweetness that somehow made the threat even more terrifying than if she had shouted or raged. "That's just a small taste of what awaits disobedience, just a reminder of what failure earns in this house. I want you to remember this feeling, to think about it every time you're tempted to be careless or lazy or forgetful." The actual burning, the first time Helena pressed hot metal against Adira's flesh and held it there while she screamed, came 2 months later, when the girl accidentally caught and tore a piece of delicate imported lace on one of Helena's most expensive gowns, while helping her mistress dress for an important social function. The damage was genuinely minor, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't looking for it, easily repaired by a skilled seamstress. But Helena's reaction was neither minor nor easily addressed. The mistress hadn't screamed or raged or shown any outward sign of anger that might have at least provided some warning. Instead, with movements that were calm and deliberate, and somehow more frightening than any explosion of temper could have been, she had simply walked to the fireplace, retrieved the glowing poker with a cloth wrapped carefully around its handle, and pressed the red-hot tip firmly against Adira's left shoulder blade, holding it there, while counting slowly to 3 in that same sweet, gentle voice she had used during the first threat. The girl's scream had echoed through the house, a sound of pure agony that brought no help from anyone. Only the knowing and terrible silence of other enslaved people who had learned through hard experience that Helena's private chambers were a kingdom unto themselves, where the mistress's word was absolute law and her cruelty faced no limits or consequences. Cato had been in the hallway when it happened, and later he would tell Adira that he had frozen in place, his old hands trembling with rage and helplessness, knowing that any intervention on his part would only result in his own punishment and do nothing to help her. Dinah had been in the kitchen below and had heard the scream, and she had simply closed her eyes and whispered a prayer, knowing exactly what was happening, and knowing there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. The brand healed slowly over the following weeks into a raised circular scar, a permanent reminder literally burned into her flesh that would mark her for the rest of her life. Adira tended it as best she could with the limited resources available to enslaved people: cool water, poultices made from plants that grew near the quarters, bandages torn from old cloth. The pain was excruciating for days, making it difficult to sleep or move or perform her duties, but she continued serving Helena because there was no alternative, no escape from her responsibilities, no matter how much agony she was in. And Helena seemed to take particular pleasure in making Adira reach for things on high shelves or carry heavy items that would stretch and stress the burned area, reopening the wound and causing fresh bleeding. But that first brand wasn't the last such mark, not by any measure. Over the following 12 years, Helena methodically added 3 more burns to Adira's back, a constellation of circular scars arranged in a pattern that the mistress seemed to regard as her personal artwork, her signature written in pain and permanent disfigurement on another human being's body. Each burning followed an eerily similar pattern that became ritualized through repetition, some minor infraction or imagined slight, real or completely fabricated according to Helena's mood and whims, followed by the mistress's calm walk to the fireplace to retrieve the poker, followed by agony that Adira gradually learned to endure without giving her tormentor the satisfaction of hearing her scream, though the silent suffering was in some ways even more profound than the initial vocal reactions had been. By the 4th burning, Adira had perfected the ability to bite down on a piece of leather and endure the pain in complete silence, her body rigid and trembling, but her voice locked away where Helena couldn't reach it. Augustus Pemberton either didn't know about or didn't care to address his wife's private torture chamber, and Adira eventually concluded that it was almost certainly the latter rather than the former. The plantation house was large, but not so large that a man could remain completely ignorant of what happened within its walls. He must have seen Adira's careful movements that suggested injury, must have noticed the way she flinched when anyone approached her from behind, must have heard rumors from other enslaved people about what transpired in Helena's chambers. But he chose not to investigate, not to intervene, not to impose any limits on his wife's behavior. He spent his days managing the cotton operation with the help of brutal overseers who enforced discipline in the fields through whippings and other punishments, and his nights drinking expensive imported brandy in his wood-paneled study, occasionally wandering out to the quarters late at night to exercise what he considered his divine and legal right over the bodies of the women enslaved there. His indifference to Helena's activities wasn't kindness or ignorance, but simple apathy, born of a system that gave him absolute power and no accountability. As long as the household ran smoothly according to his standards, as long as his meals appeared on time and properly prepared, as long as his clothes were cleaned and pressed, as long as his personal comfort wasn't disturbed by complaints or disruptions, Helena could do absolutely anything she pleased with the human beings that the law defined as her property. And so the torture continued year after year, a terrible routine that became normalized through repetition until it seemed almost ordinary to those who lived within the system. Adira learned to navigate this nightmare through careful observation, strategic submission, and the development of an internal fortress where her true self could retreat and remain untouched by Helena's cruelty. She studied the mistress's moods with the intensity of a scholar studying ancient texts, learning to predict storms before they broke by reading tiny signals in Helena's voice and posture and expression. She perfected the art of invisible efficiency, completing tasks flawlessly while making herself forgettable and unremarkable, avoiding anything that might draw special attention or scrutiny. She watched and listened and remembered everything, every casual conversation between Augustus and his business associates about cotton prices and slave markets, every whispered complaint between Helena and her sister, who visited monthly from a neighboring plantation, every routine and pattern that governed life in the main house and might someday prove useful. The other house slaves knew that Adira carried Helena's marks, though she kept them carefully hidden beneath her clothes and never spoke about what happened in the mistress's private chambers. There was an unspoken understanding among them, a shared knowledge of suffering that required no words. There was Cato, the elderly butler who had served the Pembertons for 40 years and had seen 3 generations of cruelty, who moved through the house like a ghost and spoke in whispers. There was Dinah, the cook, whose skill with food was the only thing Augustus truly appreciated about his household, who ruled her kitchen domain with efficiency and fed the house slaves better than they would have eaten otherwise. There was young Jessie, barely 12 years old, who polished boots and ran messages, and whose wide eyes had not yet been completely deadened by the horrors he witnessed daily. They formed a silent community of survival, sharing warnings and small acts of kindness when Helena's attention was elsewhere, supporting each other in ways that were invisible to their oppressors, but crucial to maintaining sanity and humanity. But Adira kept her deepest thoughts to herself, sharing her plans and feelings with absolutely no one. She had learned through bitter experience that trust was dangerous, that even the kindest soul might break under torture and reveal secrets, that survival meant holding your cards close and never showing your hand until the moment came to play it. So she held her rage close, nurturing it like a carefully tended flame, feeding it with every indignity and every scar, and every moment of helpless fury, building it into something that would one day demand release and find expression in ways that no one could predict. The turning point came in the summer of Adira's 26th year, though its seeds had been planted long before, and the explosion had been building pressure for over a decade. Helena had always been intensely territorial about her husband's attention, despite seeming to hold him in contempt and showing no genuine affection for him in private. When she suspected Augustus of favoring any particular enslaved woman, her vengeance was swift and brutal, not directed against her husband who held all the real power and could not be challenged, but against the woman she saw as a rival, as if enslaved women had any choice whatsoever in refusing a master's advances or resisting his violations. That summer, Helena became convinced, based on nothing more substantial than paranoid suspicion and jealous imagination, that Augustus had developed some kind of attachment to Adira. The evidence was circumstantial at best and mostly imaginary. Augustus had asked Adira to bring him whiskey in his study on a few occasions when Cato was unavailable or occupied with other duties, and he had commented once or twice that she was efficient in her service and less clumsy than some of the other house slaves. But Helena's jealousy didn't require evidence, only suspicion, and once the idea took root in her mind, it grew like poison. Her treatment of Adira intensified dramatically, the impossible standards becoming even more stringent and arbitrary, the punishments more frequent and severe, the verbal abuse more cutting and personal. The final crisis came on a sweltering August evening, when the heat seemed to press down on Magnolia Grove like a physical weight, and tempers throughout the plantation were strained to breaking point. Helena summoned Adira to her chambers for the nightly ritual of undressing and preparing her for bed, a process that normally took about 30 minutes, but could stretch to hours if the mistress was in a cruel mood. That evening, Helena was in one of her cold, controlled rages, the kind that were somehow more terrifying than her occasional explosions of temper, because they suggested calculated malice rather than momentary anger. Her movements were precise and deliberate, her voice carrying that dangerous sweetness that Adira had learned to recognize as a warning sign. She ordered Adira to brush her hair, then immediately declared the brushing too rough and careless. She ordered it brushed more gently, then declared it too soft and ineffective. Each attempt was wrong, each failure noted with icy displeasure and cutting comments about Adira's incompetence and worthlessness. The cycle repeated over and over, the mistress finding fault with every single stroke of the brush, working herself into a state of cold fury that had nothing to do with hair brushing and everything to do with her jealous fantasies about her husband's imagined interest in this enslaved woman. Finally, after nearly an hour of this torture, Helena stood abruptly and walked with deliberate steps to the fireplace where the poker glowed red with heat as it always did. She pulled it from the flames and turned to face Adira, her beautiful face completely expressionless, her ice-blue eyes flat and dead like a shark's eyes, holding the glowing iron like a weapon. "Remove your dress," she commanded in that terrifyingly calm voice. "I think we need another reminder of your place here. Another mark to help you remember that you are nothing, that you own nothing, that you are owned." In that moment, something inside Adira's chest cracked with an almost audible sound, like ice breaking on a frozen river at the first touch of spring. For 12 years she had endured, had submitted, had swallowed her rage and bent her will entirely toward survival. She had accumulated 4 circular scars from previous burnings, countless smaller burns and injuries, bruises and humiliations beyond counting. She had perfected the art of invisibility and obedience, had mastered the skill of hiding her true self so deep that no torture could reach it. But there are limits to human endurance that even the strongest person cannot exceed, breaking points that arrive without warning when the spirit can simply take no more. No. The word emerged from Adira's mouth quietly but firmly, hanging in the perfumed air of Helena's chamber like a declaration of war, like a line drawn that could never be uncrossed. Helena's expression flickered through a rapid sequence of emotions: surprise, confusion, fury, and finally something that looked almost like excitement, as if she had been waiting for this moment of defiance, hoping for it even, needing Adira to finally break so that she could justify unleashing the full measure of her cruelty without any restraint whatsoever. "What did you say?" Helena's voice was soft and dangerous, barely above a whisper, the kind of quiet that precedes violence. Adira raised her eyes, another forbidden act, another violation of the unspoken rules that governed every interaction between enslaved people and their owners, and met her mistress's gaze directly for the first time in 12 years. In that moment, 12 years of careful control and strategic submission shattered completely. The fortress she had built inside herself crumbled, and what emerged from the ruins was something raw and powerful, and absolutely unwilling to submit to another burning. "I said no. You will not burn me again. Not tonight. Not ever again." The mistress laughed, a brittle sound like breaking glass, high-pitched and unnatural in the quiet room. "You forget yourself, girl. You forget what you are, what you will always be." She stepped forward with the glowing poker raised like a weapon, its tip still radiating heat that Adira could feel from several feet away. "I think you need to remember. What happened next occurred in mere seconds, but would echo across the following days and weeks, and ultimately change both their lives forever." As Helena raised the poker toward Adira's face, clearly intending to brand her somewhere visible where the mark could never be hidden, the enslaved woman moved with a speed born of pure desperation and 12 years of accumulated fury. Her hand shot out and grabbed a heavy silver candlestick from the nearby table, one of a pair that had been imported from England and was worth more than Adira's entire theoretical market value, and swung it in a single fluid motion that connected solidly with Helena's wrist. The impact made a sickening crack that both women heard clearly. The poker flew from the mistress's suddenly nerveless hand, clattering across the polished wooden floor and rolling toward the far wall, still glowing with residual heat. Helena stumbled backward, clutching her injured wrist against her chest, her eyes wide with shock and the sudden, unfamiliar experience of physical pain inflicted by someone she had tormented for over a decade. For the first time in Adira's memory, the mistress looked genuinely afraid, her carefully maintained mask of superiority and control cracking to reveal something vulnerable and human underneath. That fear lasted only a heartbeat before transforming into rage so profound it seemed to fill the entire room and consume all the oxygen. "You struck me," Helena whispered, her voice trembling with fury and disbelief, as if the very concept was so foreign she could barely comprehend it. "You dare to strike me? You dare to raise your hand against me?" She rushed toward the door, toward the bell pull that would summon servants and overseers, toward the machinery of punishment that would certainly mean Adira's death by the most brutal means available. But Adira was faster, her body moving on instinct and adrenaline. She crossed the room in 3 long strides and caught Helena's arm, pulling her back with strength, born of years of field work and cotton picking before she had been brought into the house. The 2 women struggled, crashing into furniture, knocking over a small table that sent crystal perfume bottles shattering across the floor in an explosion of glass and expensive scents. Helena was screaming now, high-pitched and piercing, but the main house was large and well-built, and Augustus was in his study at the far end of the first floor, likely too drunk by this hour to notice or care about distant sounds. Adira's hand found Helena's throat, not to squeeze and kill, but to silence, pressing just hard enough to cut off the screams that would bring others running and end this confrontation before it could reach any kind of resolution. The mistress's eyes bulged with terror and rage, her fingers clawing at Adira's arm and leaving bloody scratches that the enslaved woman barely felt through the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Listen to me," Adira hissed, her face inches from Helena's, close enough to see the fear and fury warring in those ice-blue eyes. "Listen very carefully, because your life depends on understanding what I'm about to tell you. You are going to stop screaming. You are going to be very, very quiet. Because if you are not, I will pick up that poker and I will show you what 12 years of your cruelty has taught me about inflicting pain." Helena's struggles weakened gradually, her body going still with a fear that Adira recognized intimately, because she had felt it herself countless times. The fear of being completely powerless, completely at another person's mercy, completely unable to control what would happen to your own body. The enslaved woman eased the pressure on her mistress's throat just enough to allow breathing, but maintained her grip, maintaining control of the situation for the first time in her entire life. "Do you understand me?" Adira's voice was steady now, cold and controlled in a way that eerily mirrored Helena's own manner during her worst moments of calculated cruelty. The mistress nodded, a tiny movement, her ice-blue eyes still wide and terrified. What Adira did next was not born of any plan or careful strategy, but rather of an instinct for justice, married to a rage that had been building pressure for 12 years, and finally found an outlet. She forced Helena toward the fireplace where the poker still lay on the floor, its tip no longer glowing red-hot, but still radiating dangerous heat. Using her free hand while maintaining her grip on Helena's throat with the other, she retrieved the iron rod, testing its weight and temperature. Still hot enough to burn, though no longer at the white-hot intensity it had possessed when Helena first pulled it from the flames. "For 12 years, Adira said quietly, her voice carrying a weight of pain and anger that could have filled volumes. "You have burned your marks into my flesh. 4 brands, 4 circles that I will carry until the day I die, that will mark me forever as someone who suffered under your cruelty." She forced Helena to her knees beside the fire, positioning her with a firmness that allowed no resistance. "Tonight, you will understand what you have done. Tonight, you will carry 1 mark, just 1, so that every time you look in a mirror, every time you dress or undress, every time you feel fabric against that burned skin, you will remember that your cruelty was witnessed, that your sins are known, that you made another human being feel exactly what you are about to feel." Helena was sobbing now, no longer the composed mistress but a terrified woman, facing the consequences of years of unchecked cruelty and absolute power, exercised without mercy or restraint. She tried to plead, words tumbling out in a desperate rush, but Adira was beyond hearing, beyond caring about anything except this one moment of terrible justice. The enslaved woman pulled down the shoulder of Helena's expensive silk gown, exposing the pale, unmarked skin of her shoulder blade, the exact spot where Helena had placed Adira's first brand 12 years earlier. "You taught me that fire purifies," Adira whispered, her voice carrying an awful echo of Helena's own words spoken during previous burnings. "You taught me that pain instructs, and that suffering has value, so let me teach you what you have taught me." She pressed the poker against Helena's flesh, with the same deliberate pressure that had been used on her own body so many times. The mistress's scream was immediate and piercing, a sound of pure agony that shattered the quiet of the night. Adira held the iron steady, counting to 3 just as Helena had always done, measuring out the same amount of time and pain that had been inflicted on her, before finally pulling the poker away. The circular burn was perfect, a mirror image of the marks on Adira's own back, a permanent scar that would mark Helena Pemberton for the rest of her life. The screaming finally penetrated through the household's quiet. Footsteps thundered in the hallway, multiple people running toward Helena's chambers. Adira dropped the poker and stepped back from her mistress, her moment of vengeance complete, knowing with absolute certainty that what came next would be terrible beyond imagination. But as she watched Helena collapse onto the floor, sobbing and clutching her burned shoulder, Adira felt something she hadn't experienced in 12 years, a sense of justice, however fleeting, and however dearly it would ultimately cost. The door burst open violently. Augustus Pemberton stood there, swaying slightly from his evening's drinking, his face confused and then rapidly hardening into rage as he took in the scene before him. His wife weeping on the floor with her dress torn, and her shoulder exposed and obviously burned, the smell of scorched flesh heavy in the air. Adira standing above her with steady eyes, and no trace of regret or fear visible in her expression. "What in God's name?" he began, but Helena's sobbing words cut through his confusion. "She burned me. That devil burned me with my own poker. She attacked me and branded me like an animal." The overseer arrived next, a brutal man named Teague, who had grown wealthy administering violence on behalf of plantation owners throughout the county. He grabbed Adira's arms roughly, twisting them behind her back with practiced efficiency, already calculating what punishment such an unprecedented crime would require. Death, certainly, without any question, but probably not quickly, probably not mercifully. An example would need to be made, a spectacle created that would terrify every enslaved person, for miles around, and remind them of the absolute consequences of raising a hand against white authority. Yet even as Teague's grip tightened painfully on her arms, even as Augustus's face purpled with rage and Helena's sobs filled the room, Adira remained calm. Her eyes stayed fixed on Helena, who was now being helped to her feet by her husband, the branded mark on the mistress's shoulder already blistering and beginning to swell just as Adira's had swelled after each burning. The scar would be permanent, would mark Helena Pemberton for the rest of her life with a perfect circle of raised, discolored flesh that no amount of expensive clothing or careful positioning could completely hide. "You will hang for this," Augustus said, his voice thick with rage and alcohol, and something that might have been genuine shock that an enslaved woman had dared to do such a thing. "You will hang at dawn, and the entire plantation will watch. Every slave will see what happens to those who forget their place." Adira finally spoke, her voice clear and steady despite the certain knowledge of what awaited her. "Then I will hang knowing that your wife will carry my mark for the rest of her life. Every time she sees it in a mirror, every time she feels the scar tissue under her clothes, every time someone asks her about it, she will remember that her cruelty was answered, that her sins did not go unpunished, that even the powerless can find a way to make their pain known and their suffering acknowledged." Helena's sobbing intensified at those words. Whether from physical pain or from the terrible truth they contained, no one could say. As Teague dragged Adira from the room toward whatever fate awaited her, she held her head high for the first time in her life. She had lived 26 years as property, as a thing to be used and discarded according to the whims of those who claimed ownership over her very existence. But in those final moments in Helena's chamber, she had reclaimed something essential and irreplaceable: her humanity, her agency, her fundamental right to resist cruelty and assert her own will, even in the face of certain death. Whatever came next, whatever horrors awaited her in the hours before dawn, that reclamation could not be taken away. They threw her into the punishment shed, a windowless structure barely large enough to stand in, used for holding enslaved people awaiting severe discipline. The door slammed shut, plunging her into absolute darkness. Adira sank to the dirt floor, her back against the rough wooden wall, and waited for dawn and death. But as the hours passed in that suffocating darkness, something unexpected happened. Adira didn't feel regret or crushing despair. She didn't feel the overwhelming fear that might be expected of someone facing certain execution. Instead, she felt a strange lightness, as if some massive burden she had carried for 12 years had finally been set down and could never be picked up again. She had struck back against her tormentor. She had made Helena Pemberton feel a fraction of the pain she had inflicted so casually and so frequently. For once in her entire life, Adira had not been powerless. That knowledge sustained her through the long night as she waited for whatever dawn would bring. Outside the punishment shed, Magnolia Grove was alive with urgent activity that Adira could hear but not see. Augustus had sent riders to fetch Dr. Morrison from town to tend to Helena's burn, and the doctor arrived near midnight, his medical bag in hand and his expression grave. He cleaned and dressed the wound, while Helena alternated between sobbing and demanding that Adira be made to suffer beyond anything the plantation had ever witnessed. "I want her whipped until she can't stand," Helena hissed through clenched teeth as the doctor applied salve to her blistered shoulder. "I want every slave on this plantation to watch. I want them to see what happens to those who forget their place." But Dr. Morrison, a practical man who had served the plantation families for 30 years and had seen the consequences of both excessive leniency and excessive brutality, offered unexpected counsel that would change the trajectory of events. "Mrs. Pemberton, you should consider the implications of this situation carefully. If word spreads throughout the county that one of your house slaves managed to overpower you and brand you in your own chamber, it will invite uncomfortable questions. Questions about how such a thing was possible in the first place. Questions about what treatment might have provoked such an extreme and desperate act." Helena's face flushed with fury. "Are you suggesting this was somehow my fault?" "I'm suggesting," the doctor said carefully, choosing his words with diplomatic precision, "that the other plantation families might wonder about the specific circumstances that led to this incident. They might wonder what treatment would drive an enslaved woman to commit an act that she knew with absolute certainty would result in her death. And they might begin examining their own households more carefully, asking questions you would prefer remain unasked." Augustus, who had been drinking steadily since discovering the scene in his wife's chambers, looked up with bleary eyes that struggled to focus. "What are you proposing, Morrison?" "Sell her," the doctor said simply, as if discussing the disposition of livestock rather than a human life. Quietly and quickly, to a trader heading west or south somewhere far from Mississippi where the story won't follow. Tell people she ran off into the swamps, or that you sold her for general insubordination. The burn will heal with proper treatment, and with careful dressing and time, the scar can be minimized and perhaps explained away as an accident. But a public execution will draw attention from every plantation owner within 50 miles. They'll come to witness it, and they'll talk and they'll speculate about what really happened here tonight. Helena started to protest violently, but Augustus raised his hand to silence her, his word overriding hers for once in their marriage. The doctor makes sense. A hanging would bring crowds of witnesses and endless speculation. Better to handle this quietly and preserve our reputation. "I want her to suffer," Helena insisted, her voice breaking with pain and fury and something that might have been shame. "She will," Augustus replied coldly, his practical nature asserting itself over any emotional response. Being sold to a chain gang or a sugar plantation in Louisiana is a slower death than hanging, but no less certain, and it has the considerable advantage of keeping our household affairs private and avoiding uncomfortable scrutiny. So Adira's fate was decided not by principles of justice, but by the Pembertons' need to protect their social standing and avoid questions that might expose Helena's systematic cruelty. She would be sold, but not before receiving a punishment severe enough to satisfy Helena's rage, while stopping short of permanent maiming that would significantly reduce her sale value. At dawn, they dragged Adira from the punishment shed to the whipping post that stood in the center of the slave quarters, a permanent fixture that served as a constant reminder of the violence that underlay the entire system. Every enslaved person on Magnolia Grove was forced to attend, as was customary for public punishments, meant to terrorize and control through spectacle. They gathered in a silent circle, eyes downcast, bodies tense with the knowledge that they were about to witness something terrible, and that any show of sympathy or solidarity would bring punishment down on themselves. Teague secured Adira's wrists to the post, stretching her arms above her head until her feet barely touched the ground. Her dress was cut away without ceremony, exposing her back with its 4 circular brand scars, Helena's previous artwork now visible to everyone assembled. A collective intake of breath ran through the gathered crowd at the sight of those marks, a sound that spoke volumes about what had been suspected, but never confirmed. Now the evidence was undeniable, and every person present understood more fully what had driven Adira to her desperate act of resistance. Augustus emerged from the house, his face grim and his manner official as he addressed the gathered slaves with practiced authority. This woman struck her mistress. She raised her hand in violence against the one who fed her, clothed her, and gave her a position of trust in the household. Such betrayal cannot and will not be tolerated. Let this punishment remind you all of the natural order that governs this plantation and your place within it. What he carefully didn't mention, what could never be spoken aloud in such a public setting, were the 4 circular scars that told a very different story about who had raised hands against whom first, about 12 years of systematic torture that had finally provoked a desperate response. Teague raised the whip, a leather cat-o'-nine-tails, designed specifically for inflicting maximum pain across a wide area. He was an expert with it, able to control precisely how much damage each strike would cause, how to tear flesh without hitting vital areas, how to create suffering that would last for weeks without causing immediate death. Augustus had instructed him to deliver 20 lashes, enough to be devastating and leave permanent scars, but not enough to kill or permanently cripple. Adira was still valuable property after all, and would fetch a better price if she could eventually return to work. The first lash struck like lightning, splitting the sky, tearing across her shoulders and wrapping around her ribs with explosive force. Adira bit down hard on her lip, refusing to scream, refusing to give them that satisfaction or that victory. The second lash followed quickly, then the third, each one precisely placed to maximize pain while avoiding truly critical areas. By the 10th lash, her back was a mess of torn flesh and flowing blood. By the 15th, her vision was blurring and consciousness flickering like a candle in strong wind. But through it all, even as her body betrayed her and began shutting down from shock and trauma, she held on to one thought like a lifeline. Helena would carry that brand forever. Every time the mistress looked in a mirror, every time she dressed or bathed or felt fabric against that scarred shoulder, she would remember that even the powerless could strike back, that cruelty could be answered, that suffering could be acknowledged and avenged. That knowledge sustained Adira through the remaining lashes, a small core of defiance that physical pain couldn't quite extinguish. When it was finally over, they cut her down, and she collapsed into the dirt like a puppet with cut strings. Dinah and another woman were permitted to carry her to a cabin, where they cleaned her wounds as best they could with water, and applied crude medicines, poultices made from herbs that grew near the quarters, bandages torn from old cloth. Adira drifted in and out of consciousness, fever burning through her torn body as infection set in almost immediately. For 3 days, she lay in that cabin hovering between life and death, while the women of the quarters took turns nursing her. They brought water and thin broth when she could swallow, changed her bandages when blood soaked through, whispered words of comfort and something else, words of admiration spoken so quietly they could be denied if overheard. "You made her feel it," Dinah whispered once when no one else was near. "You made her know what she'd done to you. That takes more courage than anything I ever seen in my whole life." On the 4th day, Adira woke to find her fever had broken and consciousness had returned, though her body remained a mass of pain. That same morning, the slave trader arrived, a rough man named Cortland, who specialized in difficult cases, enslaved people who had proven troublesome and needed to be moved far from their original locations, where their stories might inspire others to similar resistance. Augustus negotiated the sale in his study, while Adira was brought to stand before them, her wounds still fresh and visible, her body weak, but her eyes still holding that same unbroken defiance that no amount of torture had managed to crush. Cortland examined her with the detached assessment of someone evaluating livestock, noting the whip marks and the brands, calculating how much work he could extract before she broke completely or died. "She's damaged goods," Cortland observed, though his tone suggested interest rather than rejection. "She's strong and capable when properly motivated," Augustus countered, engaging in the familiar dance of negotiation. "Just needs a firmer hand than we could provide here in a domestic setting." They settled on a price substantially lower than Adira would have fetched undamaged, but still significant enough to make the transaction worthwhile for Augustus. Money changed hands. Papers were signed transferring ownership, and just like that, Adira's fate was sealed. She would be loaded onto Cortland's wagon, along with other enslaved people he had purchased from neighboring plantations, all of them bound for destinations unknown. Helena watched from an upstairs window as Adira was loaded onto the wagon, her shoulder still bandaged beneath her expensive dress, the burn still painful and raw. As the wagon prepared to pull away, Adira looked up one final time and met Helena's eyes across the distance. Even weakened and bound, even facing an uncertain future that would almost certainly end in death, the enslaved woman's gaze carried an unmistakable message. "I marked you. I made you feel what you inflicted on me for 12 years, and you will never, ever forget." The wagon rolled south away from Magnolia Grove, carrying Adira toward whatever fresh nightmare awaited at the end of Cortland's route. Before we continue with Adira's journey, if you're finding this story powerful and important, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these untold stories of resistance and survival to light. Now, let's see what fate has in store for Adira. The journey was brutal from the first mile. Cortland's wagon carried 6 enslaved people, purchased from various plantations, all of them chained together and exposed to the elements. They traveled during the day through oppressive heat, stopping only when absolutely necessary. Cortland and his assistant were efficient rather than deliberately cruel. They had no interest in tormenting their cargo beyond what was necessary to maintain control, but they also showed no compassion or recognition of the humanity of the people they transported. On the second night, they made camp near a river crossing. The enslaved people were chained beneath the wagon, while Cortland and his assistant set up their own camp nearby and settled in for the evening. As darkness fell, and the 2 white men drank whiskey by their fire, Adira began testing her shackles with the subtle movements of someone who had learned patience through years of survival. The iron cuff on her left wrist had a flaw where the metal had been imperfectly forged, a thin weak spot that might be exploitable with enough time and determination. The other enslaved people chained with her noticed her careful movements. There was Marcus, a field hand sold for fighting with an overseer. There was Ruth, an older woman sold because age had reduced her work capacity. There was young Thomas, barely 16, sold for reasons he didn't understand. They watched Adira with a mixture of curiosity, fear, and desperate hope. As Cortland and his assistant's voices grew louder and less cautious with drink, Adira worked her wrist methodically against the weak point in the shackle. The movement abraded her skin and added fresh blood to her bandages. But pain had long since become something she could work through rather than surrender to. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. The fire burned down to embers. Finally, Cortland and his assistant succumbed to sleep and whiskey. In the darkness beneath the wagon, Adira felt the shackle give way, not breaking completely, but spreading just enough for her to work her hand through, pulling and twisting until skin tore and knuckles scraped raw, but her hand came free. She held it before her face in the darkness, marveling at this small freedom. Then she set to work on the ankle shackles, using the broken wrist cuff as a tool. Marcus whispered urgently, "What are you doing? They'll kill us all when they find out." Adira's response was barely audible. "They're taking us somewhere to die slowly anyway. I'd rather die running than die in chains." The ankle shackle opened with a soft click. Adira was free. She looked at the others, still chained, their eyes reflecting moonlight and desperate hope and fear. "I can't free you all quietly, but I can run, and if I make it to freedom, at least one of us escaped." Ruth nodded slowly with something like blessing in her eyes. "Then run, child. Run fast and carry our hope with you." Adira crawled from beneath the wagon and made it to the tree line without raising alarm. Then she straightened and began moving through the darkness, heading north by the stars, toward a freedom she had never known but could now almost imagine. The Mississippi forest swallowed Adira whole, its darkness both shelter and constant threat. She moved through the undergrowth with desperate urgency, ignoring the thorns that tore at her already ravaged skin, ignoring the fever that still lingered in her blood, making every movement feel like wading through deep water. Every sound made her freeze in place. The snap of a twig under her own feet, the rustle of leaves in the night breeze, the distant call of an owl hunting. Any of them could signal pursuit, could mean the end of this fragile freedom she had stolen in the darkness beneath Cortland's wagon. By dawn she had covered perhaps 5 miles, a pitiful distance that would mean nothing once the trader discovered her absence and sent out trackers with dogs. She needed shelter desperately, needed to hide during daylight when her presence would be impossible to conceal. The wounds on her back had reopened during the night's flight, leaving a trail of blood that hunting dogs would follow with ease. She was a fugitive now, subject to all the brutal machinery that existed specifically to capture and punish those who dared to run toward freedom. Adira found a hollow beneath the massive roots of an ancient oak tree, a space barely large enough for her body. She crawled inside and used fallen branches and dead leaves to conceal the entrance, then lay absolutely still in the dark earth. Her breathing was shallow, her body trembling from exhaustion and pain and the after-effects of trauma and fever. Sleep was impossible, but she forced herself into a kind of waking stillness, conserving energy while her mind raced through possibilities and plans that all seemed equally hopeless. She knew the basics of escape from whispered conversations in the quarters over the years, fragments of knowledge passed between enslaved people like precious contraband. Head north toward the Free States, follow the North Star on clear nights, avoid roads and towns where slave catchers patrolled. Move only at night when darkness could hide you. Find the Underground Railroad if possible, though no one quite knew how to identify its stations or recognize its conductors. Trust no white person, except possibly Quakers, and even then, approach with extreme caution. Above all, keep moving, because stopping meant capture and capture meant death. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Twice she heard voices in the distance, men calling to each other, perhaps searching, perhaps just travelers or hunters going about normal business. She remained frozen in her hiding place, barely breathing, until the sounds faded into silence. By the time darkness fell again, her mouth was parched with thirst and her stomach cramped with hunger. She hadn't eaten since before the whipping 5 days ago, had barely managed water during the fever. She needed supplies and help, but accepting help meant trusting someone, and trust had been beaten out of her through years of betrayal and cruelty. Still, she couldn't survive on determination alone. The human body had absolute limits, and hers were already stretched far beyond what should have been endurable. Adira emerged from her hiding place as full darkness descended. She oriented herself by the stars. There was the North Star, constant and guiding, and began moving again. This night she was slower, more cautious, conserving strength while still making progress. She stayed away from any paths or clearings, moving through the densest forest where pursuit would be more difficult. Near midnight she smelled smoke and heard the sound of running water, a river and someone camping near it. She crept closer with movements that were silent and careful. skills learned from years of trying to be invisible in Helena's house. Through the trees, she could make out a small campfire and 2 figures beside it. As she drew nearer, details emerged. Both figures were black, both moving with the careful freedom of people who weren't constantly looking over their shoulders in fear. Free black people, or other runaways. The possibility made her heart race with hope and terror in equal measure. This could be salvation or a trap, allies or people who would turn her in for reward money. She watched for long minutes, trying to assess the risk, trying to decide whether approach was worth the potential consequences. The decision was made for her when a hand clamped over her mouth from behind and a strong arm wrapped around her waist, lifting her off the ground. She struggled instinctively, but the grip was iron firm and the voice that whispered in her ear was urgent, but not hostile. "Stop fighting. We're trying to help you, but you need to be quiet or you'll bring every slave catcher in the county down on all of us." The man carrying her brought her into the firelight, where the other 2 figures could see her clearly. Up close they were a man and a woman, both perhaps in their 30s, wearing simple but intact clothing that suggested neither slavery nor wealth. The man who had grabbed her set her down carefully, and she immediately stumbled, her legs barely supporting her weight. The woman gasped when she saw Adira's condition, the fresh blood seeping through her tattered dress, the obvious signs of recent severe whipping, the fever flush still visible on her face despite the broken crisis. "Lord have mercy. What did they do to you?" 20 lashes for striking my mistress," Adira managed, her voice hoarse from days without proper water. Before that, 12 years of her particular brand of Christian charity. The man who had grabbed her studied her face carefully with eyes that had clearly seen many fugitives in similar condition. "You're running from Cortland's chain gang. We heard he was moving through this area with fresh purchases. How long you been free?" 2 nights. Adira swayed dangerously, the world tilting and spinning. "Need water. Need to keep moving north." The woman, she introduced herself as Sarah, brought water in a battered tin cup and made Adira drink slowly despite her desperate thirst. "You drink too fast after days without, you'll just bring it back up and waste it. Small sips. That's right. Easy now." The man was named Jacob, and he explained that they were conductors on the Underground Railroad, moving between safe houses and helping fugitives make the dangerous journey north to free states and sometimes all the way to Canada. They had been waiting at this rendezvous point for another group that was supposed to arrive 3 days ago but hadn't shown up, which likely meant capture or death. "We can take you with us," Jacob said quietly. "But you need to understand the risks clearly. Cortland will have trackers out by now, probably with dogs. Your wounds leave a trail a blind man could follow. We can help you. We will help you. But it won't be easy, and there are absolutely no guarantees of success." "There were never any guarantees," Adira replied, accepting another small sip of water that tasted better than anything she had ever experienced. "But I'd rather die trying to reach freedom than live one more day as someone's property." Sarah cleaned Adira's wounds with water from the river and applied a poultice made from herbs she carried in her worn pack. The pain was intense, but Adira barely flinched, having long ago learned to divorce herself from physical sensation when necessary, to retreat to that internal fortress where pain couldn't quite reach. As Sarah worked with gentle efficiency, she explained the route they would take, north through Mississippi into Tennessee, then across into Kentucky, and eventually to the Ohio River, which marked the boundary between slave states and free states. "It's at least 3 weeks of hard travel," Sarah warned, securing fresh bandages around Adira's torso. "And that's if everything goes perfectly, which it never does. You're in no condition for this kind of journey. Honestly, you should be in bed recovering for weeks, not running through forests in the middle of the night." "I'll recover, or I'll die," Adira said with simple finality. "Either way, I'm not going back. I'd rather die free than live in chains." They let the fire die down to nothing and prepared to move out, but before they could depart, Jacob held up a hand for silence. In the distance, barely audible but growing steadily louder, came a sound that transformed Adira's blood to ice. Dogs baying on a scent trail, that particular excited tone that meant they had found something and were closing distance. "They're tracking you," Jacob said quietly, already moving to gather their minimal supplies. "We need to move now, and we need to break your trail, or those dogs will lead them right to us, and we'll all hang together." Sarah pulled out a small bottle from her pack, its contents precious and carefully rationed. "Pepper and other compounds. It'll confuse the dog's sense of smell temporarily, buy us some time, but we need to get to the river. Let the water carry our scent away downstream." They moved quickly through the darkness, Adira supported between Jacob and Sarah, as her wounded body threatened to give out completely. Behind them, the baying of the hounds grew steadily louder and more excited as they closed the distance. The hunters had found her trail and were following it with the inexorable patience of men who had done this many times before and knew that fugitives almost always made mistakes born of desperation and exhaustion. The river appeared through the trees, moonlight glinting off its dark surface. It was wider than Adira had expected from the sound, the current strong and potentially dangerous. Jacob didn't hesitate. He waded directly in, the water rising to his chest, and gestured urgently for the women to follow. "We go downstream," he instructed tersely, "staying in the shallows where we can touch bottom when possible, swimming where we must. The current will help carry us, and the water will hide our scent from the dogs. Can you swim?" Adira nodded, though in truth she had never had opportunity to learn properly. Enslaved people were rarely given access to rivers for recreation, but she would manage or drown, and drowning seemed infinitely preferable to capture and the torture that would precede execution. They pushed into the current, letting it carry them while using their feet to push off the rocky bottom when possible. The cold water was shocking against Adira's fevered skin, stealing what little warmth remained in her traumatized body, but it also numbed the pain in her back temporarily, a small mercy in an otherwise desperate situation. Behind them, the dogs reached the riverbank. Their baying turned frustrated and confused as the scent trail disappeared completely into the water. Adira could hear men's voices now, cursing and shouting instructions to each other. Cortland's voice rose above the others, furious and determined. He had lost valuable property, and men like him didn't accept such losses without exhausting every possible avenue of recovery. The fugitives let the river carry them for nearly a mile, a journey that felt endless as the current pulled and pushed and threatened to drag them under. By the time Jacob finally guided them toward the opposite bank, Adira's teeth were chattering so violently she had bitten her tongue and tasted blood. They emerged soaked and shivering, and Sarah immediately wrapped Adira in a blanket from her pack, while Jacob scattered the pepper compound behind them, masking their exit point from the water. "They'll search both banks," Jacob said quietly, helping support Adira, who could barely stand. "But we've bought ourselves time and distance. There's a safe house about 10 miles north of here. If we can reach it by dawn, we'll have shelter and a chance to rest properly." 10 miles might as well have been 100 to someone in Adira's condition. She could barely remain conscious, her body pushed so far beyond its limits that it was beginning to simply shut down. But Sarah and Jacob supported her between them, half carrying her through the forest, while listening constantly for sounds of pursuit, and somehow she kept moving, kept putting one foot in front of the other through sheer force of will. The night passed in a blur of pain and movement and semi-consciousness. Adira drifted between awareness and something deeper, her mind retreating to fragmentary memories and hallucinations. She remembered her mother's hands braiding her hair. She remembered the moment she had pressed the poker against Helena's flesh and heard her scream. She remembered and dreamed and hallucinated until she could no longer distinguish between past and present, between memory and reality. Dawn was breaking when they finally reached the safe house, a small cabin that looked abandoned from the outside, but proved to be maintained specifically for sheltering fugitives. An elderly white couple emerged as they approached, Quakers named Thomas and Rebecca, who welcomed them inside with quiet efficiency born of long practice. Rebecca took charge of Adira immediately, leading her to a small room with an actual bed covered in clean sheets, luxuries that seemed impossible after so many days of suffering. She cleaned the wounds properly with real medicine and soap, applied fresh bandages, and helped Adira into a clean nightgown, while speaking in a gentle voice about healing and hope and the possibility of reaching freedom. "You're safe here for now," Rebecca said softly, helping Adira lie down carefully on her side to avoid pressure on her wounded back. "Rest. Let your body heal. We'll keep watch, and if any slave catchers come near, we have hiding places they've never found, despite searching many times." Adira wanted to argue, wanted to insist on continuing immediately, but her body had reached absolute limits. The moment her head touched the pillow, she fell into unconsciousness so deep it resembled death more than sleep. She slept for nearly 2 days, waking only occasionally to accept water and thin broth that Rebecca spooned into her mouth. When she finally woke fully, lucid and aware for the first time since her escape, 3 days had passed. Her body had begun genuine healing, her fever had broken completely, and her mind had cleared. Jacob and Sarah were still there, waiting for her recovery. They had news. Cortland had indeed searched the area extensively with dogs and armed men, but the river trick had worked. The trail had gone cold, and without clear direction the searchers had eventually moved on, assuming either that Adira had drowned or that she had made it far enough away to be someone else's problem. "You're still in grave danger," Jacob warned, as Adira sat up carefully in bed, testing her strength. "But you've survived what kills most people who try to run. Now we need to decide, continue north together or stay here longer to heal more fully before attempting the journey." Adira thought of Helena's face at that upstairs window watching her departure. She thought of the brand she had left on her mistress's shoulder, a permanent reminder that even the powerless could strike back. She thought of 12 years of systematic torture and what it had cost her to resist, and what it would cost to complete this journey to freedom. "I go north," she said, her voice weak but her determination absolute. "I didn't survive this long just to stop now when freedom might actually be possible." Rebecca helped Adira dress in clothes donated by the Quaker community, simple, practical garments that transformed her appearance completely. Clean and properly dressed, with her wounds hidden beneath layers of fabric, she looked almost like a free woman rather than an escaped slave. The transformation was startling and gave her the first genuine hope she had felt since childhood. They prepared to depart at nightfall, but Thomas called them to the window urgently. 2 riders were approaching the cabin, white men moving with purpose and carrying themselves with the authority of those who enforced laws for profit. Slave catchers, going house to house in their systematic search. Thomas led them quickly to what appeared to be a root cellar, but when he moved aside several barrels, a false wall was revealed. Behind it was a cramped space barely large enough for 3 people. They squeezed inside, and Thomas replaced the wall and barrels, plunging them into absolute darkness. Through the floorboards above, they heard the slave catchers arrive and demand to search the premises. Thomas and Rebecca responded with calm Quaker dignity, insisting their religious principles prevented participation in slavery. The search was thorough. Boots walked directly over their hiding spot. Furniture was moved, barrels were checked, but the construction held, and after 20 tense minutes the searchers departed unsatisfied. When Thomas finally opened the false wall, Adira emerged trembling. The close call had stripped away her brief sense of security, reminding her that safety was always temporary and conditional. "They'll return," Rebecca said quietly. "You need to leave tonight." So as darkness fell, Adira found herself once again moving through forest, heading north with Jacob and Sarah. The journey that followed was grueling. 3 weeks of hiding by day and traveling by night, passing through a network of safe houses maintained by people who risked everything to help fugitives. Each day brought new dangers, close calls with slave catchers, rivers to cross, terrain that seemed designed to kill anyone attempting passage. But slowly, painfully, impossibly, they made progress. Mississippi gave way to Tennessee, then Kentucky. The landscape changed as they traveled north, and so did Adira. Her body healed gradually, the whip wounds scarring over to join Helena's 4 circular brands. But more importantly, something inside her began to heal as well, the part that had been broken by 12 years of systematic torture and taught to accept powerlessness as natural. After 3 weeks they reached the Ohio River, the boundary between slavery and freedom. On the far shore lay a state where slavery had no legal standing, where Adira would no longer be property, but a person with rights under law. They crossed at night in a small boat, Adira's hands gripping the side so tightly her knuckles went white. When the boat scraped against the northern shore, Jacob helped her out, and she stood on free soil for the first time in her life. "You made it," Sarah said softly, tears in her eyes. "Against all odds, you actually made it to freedom." Adira looked back across the dark water toward Mississippi, toward Magnolia Grove and Helena Pemberton. She touched her shoulder, where the first brand scar lay beneath her dress, then smiled knowing Helena carried a matching mark. She had been tortured for 12 years, had struck back against her tormentor, had survived 20 lashes that should have killed her, had escaped from a slave trader's chain gang, and had traveled hundreds of miles through hostile territory to reach freedom. She had reclaimed her humanity, her agency, her right to exist as something other than property. Whatever came next, and she knew the journey wasn't truly over, that she would need to travel further north to be truly safe. She would face it as a free woman. She had branded her mistress on the same fire that once burned her, had made her tormentor feel the pain she had inflicted, and had survived to tell the story. If this story of resistance and survival moved you, please hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. These stories matter, these voices deserve to be heard, and your support helps us continue bringing them to light. Thank you for watching, And until next time, remember that even in the darkest moments of history, the human spirit found ways to resist, to survive, and ultimately to triumph. Adira walked forward into her new life, carrying her scars, but no longer defined by them, branded but unbroken, free at last.